Good evening, everyone. My name is Sipan Zadorian, and I would like to call this meeting to order. Today is the special meeting of the Landlord Tenant Ad Hoc Committee taking place on Wednesday, March 22nd, 2023 at 7:06 p.m.
6:07.
Sorry, 6:07 p.m. May we have roll call, please?
Committee member Jennifer Schultz Bertolet.
Here.
Committee member Razmi Grigorian. Absent. Committee member Victor Herpetian.
Here.
Committee member Teal Marchand.
Here.
Committee member James Sun. Absent. Committee member Isabella Tavanian.
Present.
Committee member David Zargarian.
Present.
Next item on the agenda is regular business agenda. May we have the roll call, please?
The agenda for the March 22nd, 2023 regular meeting of the Tenant Landlord Ad Hoc Committee was posted on March 23rd, 2023 on the bulletin board outside City Hall. Excuse me, March 17th, 2023 on the bulletin board outside City Hall.
Next item is approval of minutes for February. Sorry? Okay. Next item is approval of minutes for February 22nd, 2023, regular meeting of the Landlord Tenant Ad Hoc Committee. Does anyone have comments? All right. Can we get a motion to approve?
Motion to move.
I'll second.
All right.
Any objections? Passes unanimously. Unanimous consent. Mr. Zadorian, may I just make a correction to the record? This is not a special meeting. This is a regular meeting, so just the agenda, I think, just had a typographical error.
Thank you. All right. Next item is oral communications. Do we have?
We have one caller on the line.
Is this for this or? Okay.
Alex Hakimian, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, you're on the air and you have 2 minutes.
Ladies and gentlemen of council and committee, my name is Alex Hakimian, resident and tenant of 345 West Lorraine. I'll try to be. I've been introduced via email through my dispute and statements that I've provided in regards to Razmi Grigorian. I hope that council has been aware of the emails and the material I and other residents of Lorraine Street have provided with regards to various ongoing disheartening disputes with Mr. Grigorian. I hope you are aware and up to date with all the matters of concern. My reason for phoning in today is for this not to be pushed under the rug. I'd like to share some information about myself before other matters of concern. As a lifelong Glendale resident, my career path in real estate and as an entrepreneur, I've had the pleasure of dealing with people from all walks of life. The one promise I've always made to myself and people is I have done business with is to be honest and straightforward. Never to take advantage of, cheat, lie, and manipulate one to get what I want. In helping people purchase their first homes, I've dealt with their life savings as if it was my own, carefully, diligently, and most importantly, respectfully, knowing how hard it is to make a living, save money, and quite frankly, pay bills. Life is hard as it is. Families don't need council, committee, legislation, and neighbors making it harder. I know your question might be asking yourselves, Alex, why haven't you moved this man is such a terrible landlord? I have, and my mother continues to live there. The reason being, as I have stated before, we are like family in that building, always attentive to one another and always looking out for each other. It's also because I haven't met someone that loves moving. Change is hard. Unfortunately, now you may ask yourself, why go through all this trouble in regards to the landlord you won't ever hear from again? It's because I stated before, I care for people. I always have and I always will. Especially since I have witnessed my neighbors being bullied and discouraged from speaking out against Mr. Grigorian. Unfortunately, Mr. Grigorian has not maintained his campaign promises, let alone common decency and conduct when it comes to tenants.
Mr. Hakimian, that's your time.
Okay. Thank you.
No other speakers.
Okay, next, where are we on the agenda? Do the committee members have any comments?
I just wanted to say, I think this is the main reason why we're here, to help support the best way we can and mediate between tenants and landlords. So it's with the caller and the previous tenants who spoke up in the last meeting, it's just confirmation of why we are here. And I hope we can be a part of many solutions to the tenant-landlord issues.
Next, we have our business agenda. It's going to be further discussion on mediation, and I will be presenting the report. If you recall, we had discussions last week on mediation programs, and the committee expressed interest in possibly having some sort of a mediation program in Glendale. We went back and did a little bit of research on a few cities that had mediation. And this report hopefully helps you make an informed decision. All right. So between our last meeting and today, we've contacted a few cities in order to see what type of programs they ran and operated. This is a list of cities that we were in contact with. Unfortunately, we weren't able to hear back from everyone. It was a very limited number of municipalities that returned our emails or phone calls. We tried multiple times. So this report is based on a few that did respond, and they're all unique programs, as you will see in a second. So these are the municipalities that did have programs, mediation programs, varying degrees. Next slide, please. The three municipalities that we did contact were the city of Burbank, County of Marin, and the city of Santa Monica. They all have different types of programs. For example, in Burbank's case, their mediation program is ran by a landlord-tenant commission, similar to the committee we have here. And we focused our report and this presentation on these three cities. Next slide, please. Starting with Burbank, there's just a little background on the city of Burbank, population, the number of housing units they have. It's a much smaller city than Glendale, about half the size as far as population. Glendale has about 70,000 units and much more renters. And as I said, the Burbank committee is ran by their commission. Next slide, please. So their program is non-mandatory and non-binding. So that means no one is required to participate in this program. If a tenant has an issue, they want to mediate it, the landlord is not required to participate in the process. And if they do participate, the ultimate decision is not binding. So the way it works with Burbank is if a tenant has an issue with their landlord, for example, they don't agree with a rent increase, they go to the city of Burbank, they fill out a form. It was attachment 1 on your report. They fill that form out, and city staff either gets back to them or refers the tenant or landlord to the commission members, and the commission members then contact these tenants to resolve the issues. They technically don't have a traditional mediation process. They don't call the landlord and tenant and have them sit there and discuss the problem. Staff basically provides information, much like we do at Rental Rights. So if you see there's an excerpt from one of their meetings, basically a tenant complained about an eviction notice, and all the commission did was inform them about their rights under AB 1482. So that's what they consider mediation. It's very basic. The types of disputes they have is rent increases, evictions, relocation fees, all types of tenant-landlord disputes. Number of cases, they said that they had 87 tenants or landlords complete a form to receive mediation through the commission. And the expected resolution time is a day to multiple weeks. Again, similar to rental rights, if we get a tenant complaining, landlord complaining, we call them, It either takes that day to resolve the issue if it's simple, or if there's a lot of back and forth, a couple of weeks.
Sipan?
Yeah.
Can I ask a question? Do you recall how often they meet?
It's once a month, if I'm not mistaken.
The committee meets once a month.
Right.
So if something gets referred,
The commission basically separates into groups, and they handle each issue separately. So if maybe there's one group that's assigned for evictions, I'm not sure exactly how the work is distributed, but they handle it before that meeting. Sometimes it's during, but most of the time they handle it before.
so if it's something that staff doesn't handle, then it gets referred to the committee, and that could potentially be a month away before the next
Right.
committee meeting. Thank you.
Do you know what types of people are on the
Yeah,
commission?
I was,
Are you getting to
it's
that?
in, yeah, so it's made up of 5 volunteers. Again, just similar to the way this committee is made up, the council members choose who's on their commission. So again, they apply, council goes through them, looks at their qualifications, and there's 5 of them, similar to ours. We have 7, but theirs works a little bit differently. They separate into smaller groups, as I said, to study whatever issue that tenant or landlord might have brought up. They do have staff that serves as a liaison to the commission, and everyone in the staff that represents the commission also has other functions in their housing department. So the commission is just a small part of their bigger organization. That's why, moving on to budget and funding, they weren't able to tell us exactly how much it costs to operate the program because it's part of just a bigger part of their funding for housing. So they fund for staff, and based on what they told us, we estimate that their costs are no more than $100,000 to operate the program.
Did they tell you how, of the 87 cases they heard in 2022, that's not necessarily mean that there were 87 mediations that took place?
If they completed a form, it's likely that it was mediated.
So both parties showed up and participated?
Again, that's not how their mediation works. The way they define mediation would be if the landlord calls the tenant, or the staff calls the landlord on behalf of the tenant to say, oh, you violated the tenant's rights here. Are you aware of these laws? Something like that is, I think, what they would consider mediation. Just basically informing them rather than getting involved that type of way.
And if that's the case, they didn't really have a record as to how successful their call to a landlord or a tenant was in resolving?
I don't think they perform follow-ups.
Oh.
So, if we go back to the other slide, that excerpt, that's basically what they provide to the tenant, and the decision to follow through with whatever they tell the tenant or landlord is on them. There's no binding decision made that the landlord or the tenant are obligated to stand by.
So it's called mediation, but it's feels more like education only.
It's very similar to what we do without the commission. It's a more public version of what we do.
I see.
Next one. So then we have the County of Marine or Marine County. They're a much bigger organization than we are, about almost, 260,000 population. They have 30,000 more housing units than we do, but they don't have as many renters, or percentage of renters. Their program has a mandatory portion and a voluntary portion. So if the landlord wants to increase the rents past 5% and the tenant wants to mediate, the landlord is required to participate in that mediation process. We move to the next slide. But if it's another issue, let's say an eviction, security deposit, another type of concern, that is not a mandatory requirement for the tenant or landlord to participate. They only require participation if the complaint or reason for mediation is rent increase above 5%. And if the landlord wants to increase it by above 5%, they have to participate in their process. They actually outsource it to their district attorney's office. So they don't handle it in-house. The district attorney's office handles it as part of their bigger mediation program. Again, it's only a small part of their county-wide mediation program that serves all types of mediation between tenants and tenants, landlords and tenants, business owners, just neighbors. And LA County actually has similar programs as well. For this program, again, disputes, as I said, rent increases are mandatory. All other types of disputes are voluntary. The resolution is non-binding, so they can't force landlord or tenant to agree on the ultimate outcome of the decision by staff. They received 287 cases, and 118 of them were mediated. Time to resolution was about 8 to 12 weeks, according to their staff. And then next slide, please. Again, their staffing was also part of their larger organization. The county district attorney's office, as part of their larger mediation program, serves tenant landlord type disputes. So for their case, they had 2 staff working on it, and funding, again, was difficult to narrow down to how much it was costing because they were part of a bigger program. We did contact a couple of places that did have services like this, and it was usually based on the number of cases you would have, so they would charge a fee based on how many cases they mediated. Next slide, please. And then we have Santa Monica. Santa Monica, if you don't know, has rent control, and their mediation program is part of their rent control program. Again, smaller city than Glendale, but they have a much bigger renter population. Next slide, please. Again, non-binding, non-mandatory. They do have certain requirements through their rent control where it might have to, it's not mediation, but landlords and tenants have certain requirements that they would have to, I guess, show up to some sort of mediation type, lost for words. They would basically have to agree to certain things where, because of the rent control laws required them to. So if the landlord wants to increase the rents past the allowed limit, they have certain things that they can do to meet, certain criteria that they can meet that would allow them to do that. They do have those types of things where a tenant would be required to participate in or a landlord would be required to participate in, but generally speaking, if the dispute is outside of their requirements for rent control, it's non-mandatory and non-binding. Again, rent increases, evictions, different types of disputes. Number of cases, 101 cases that were relevant to mediation to this type of program. The 11 construction decrease cases and 16 excessive rent increase cases would be specific to their rent control rules. So we didn't really take those into consideration. And then expected timeline, they said it should take 180 days, but it takes much longer than that. Not exactly sure why, but.
Did they say what the rent decrease cases were? Not sure what that means.
That would be, I guess, a tenant complaining that the rent was too excessive.
Illegally raised
right.
or something, or?
Either that or the tenant were just requesting a decrease in rents.
So in these examples, these 3 examples here, are they examples of mediation that was required because there was some issue with regards to their rent control ordinance? Or was this the
No,
voluntary?
that would be voluntary.
These are the voluntary items cited here? Did they say how much mediation they do based on their rent control component?
That wouldn't technically be considered mediation, that's just,
Just a ruling
Required
by
by-
their office?
yeah. And the 101 decreased cases I mean, it's just a tenant saying, I can't afford this rent, so is there anything my landlord can do to decrease it? And that starts the process.
180 days, wow.
Rent control cities usually take a lot longer to process things, from what I've noticed. Next slide. So again, staffing is hard to narrow down staffing and budget because they are part of the bigger rent control program. But there's a list of staff that they have as part of their rent control program, mediation department, a hearing officer, budget coordinator, investigator. The budget and funding for their rent control program is about $5 million. That's all of their rent control program, so it includes mediation. Again, they couldn't tell us specifically how much it costs to operate just mediation because all their staff, all their resources are also used for their rent control programs. And many of the other jurisdictions that we looked into had similar setups, so nobody had a separate, here's our mediation program, this cost us $150,000 to operate, and these 2 staff members worked on it, because most of them were part of bigger organizations. Next slide. This one is just a comparison of the 3 previous cities we just spoke about and Glendale. For Glendale's case, in the report we discussed that Glendale does a similar type of mediation as Burbank, where we call landlords and tenants and inform them of their rights. We had total of 2,500 phone calls and emails in 2022. We had 99 cases where we were involved with both landlords and tenants trying to get them to a resolution, whether that was a landlord increasing the rents past the limits or a tenant not understanding the banking, and landlords were allowed to increase past 7%. So different types of cases where a staff member had to go back and forth between tenant and landlord, and we considered those as mediation. So we had about 99 compared to 87 for Burbank, 118 for County of Marine, and 26 for Santa Monica. And ours, quick response time, either that day or within a couple of weeks. Anyone have any questions so far?
Just a question about the difference between the 2,500 calls and emails versus 99. What is the?
The 2,500 calls, it could be tenant calls and says, what is the rent cap
Or
at the
just
moment?
questions?
Right.
Okay, okay.
So just simple questions, either that or things where we have to refer to our code enforcement department or housing rights center, things we can't handle in-house. So based on the information we were able to gather, we put together potential costs of different types of programs. Our rental rights program costs about $300,000 just for reference. That includes 2 staff members and advertising budget, printing, marketing. For a formal type of mediation program with mandatory participation, staff estimates somewhere around $220,000 to $310,000. So that's an addition to the rental rights program. For a much simpler program with voluntary participation, we estimate about $210,000 at most. For a program like Burbank's with the commission, we estimate an additional $60,000 to $90,000. This is on top of the rental rights staff. Basically, rental rights staff would be taking on serving the role of a liaison to a commission, maybe an additional staff member, and outsourcing it would be the most budget-friendly, $17,000 to $50,000 possibly, depending on who we contact, how many cases we have a year, how strict we want to be with our program, with the requirements, things like that.
And the outsourcing would be like a private mediator or
Right.
something like that?
And so we put together a little worksheet of areas that we want the committee to comment on It's part of your attachment to it. I put it on your desk as well. This will help us determine the type of program that you're looking for. We can have a discussion on this, see if we have a consensus on anything, or you can all make your selections. We can put something together and make the recommendation to council that the committee was aiming for this type of a program, and see if council has interest in pursuing something like that. Anybody have any comments?
Where would the money come from for something like this?
Again, I believe it would have to be in-house. I'm just trying to think if
It would
there's
just
any
find
grants.
it within the budget somewhere else, or?
Well, if the committee came back with a recommendation to fund and establish a mediation program, we will take this back to city council, and at the time that they consider it, then the question to them would be, how do we fund this? Would it just most likely come out of general funds? Because as I'm thinking off the top of my head, I don't think some of the funding sources that we use for the Section 8 program or our affordable housing projects would necessarily support a program like that. I can tell you right now, the rental rights program and the enforcement and the education of all that is funded with a separate allocation of general funds that the council identified. And if I'm not mistaken, I want to say it was out of the Measure S money that was voted on and approved by the residents and started coming in. I believe they took a portion of some of that money and allocated it towards rental rights. So we'd have to have the same discussion with them if mediation is a recommendation.
Is there interest in a mediation program?
Yeah.
I mean, that's what we discussed in our last meeting. I'm for it.
What type of a program? What mandatory?
Yeah, I believe
Formal.
I suggested mandatory and binding. I mean, I know there were some points, pros and cons, definitely on the binding, but I just felt like if we're going to do a mediation program, then what's the point if we don't have follow-through?
The one thing about binding, we didn't see any examples of binding programs that were being done by a city. There were courts that did it, but nothing that was done by a city or a county.
Yeah, and I understand, and like I said, I know it's pros and cons to both, but I definitely believe mandatory would be important. I think it can alleviate the burden of a traditional, court system. And again, as we spoke in our last meeting, we would shape it just like this, types of disputes, very specific. So then it may be a lot and it may not. It may be things that can literally get resolved in mediations. And then if it cannot, then, the parties can take it further. But I think mediations would help people not be so intimidated, especially tenants. Tenants, as we heard from the tenants who spoke last month and the caller, and if I could just say this too, sometimes what I've seen happen or what I've observed, what I've witnessed, is the tenant is the one that is always in the fear or flight mode most of the time. They're just at that disadvantage. Because a lot of times a landlord will say, well, just move then. And then we're hearing already, and not to go further into it, but we're hearing already where, this is something I mentioned when we first started. A lot of times, especially with a landlord, they're saying, well, we don't have these issues. I don't know, what are these issues? We don't hear about them. And then all of a sudden you do. And a lot of times the issues are being swept under a rug, or tenants are forced to move because they don't want issues. I think most people just want to live in peace. So if the mediations can help bridge that gap for people to, see both sides, and a lot of it can just come, in my opinion, from education. Sometimes we're just uneducated to what is going on at the time, in my opinion.
not entirely related, but do you know if any of these programs include sort of nuisance behaviors? Like, for example, some of the hardest things for us to solve are sometimes problems between tenants, where one tenant is bothering another tenant or doing something that is really harming the other tenant, and we don't really know how to mediate that, as a landlord.
I believe the Marin County program did have tenant type resolution. Santa Monica, I don't believe so, and Burbank, I don't see why they would be against something like that because their program is more informative. So I don't think they would be against it, but Marin County had all sorts of dispute resolution programs, so that would be included tenant, and LA County has services like that too, for disputes between tenant and tenant. But yeah, that is an issue we've been getting lately where tenants are complaining about other tenants.
Sipon, of the 99 that Glendale mediated, or your staff mediated, do you know how many were initiated by tenants versus landlords? Do you have a feel of what it was?
It would probably be 90% tenant.
Initiated by tenants?
And would you say most of them were concerning security deposit, rent increases,
There was a lot of security deposit, rent increase, eviction. But evictions, there isn't a lot we can really do, so that wasn't as much. But security deposit, rent increases, and this was during the aftermath of COVID. So there was a lot of landlord or tenants calling about if they hadn't paid the rent, what's going to happen to them, how can they apply to these programs, can the landlord evict them because they didn't pay for these months, and so those types of issues.
have you seen, what's the trend currently? Is it going up, going down, staying the same?
The current trend is, because of all the rains, it's tenants calling and asking, my roof is leaking, is my landlord responsible for this? Is my landlord responsible for putting me out in a hotel? So those types of questions because of the damage to the properties. We're getting a lot of that lately. So we refer them to code enforcement, first of all, to, get the process rolling for them to fix the properties. And then we try to educate them as much as we can on their rights and what they can do in those situations.
I mean, I think from my perspective, from a tenant perspective, a mediation program would be beneficial. But generally speaking, a mediation program is intended to get the parties to settle quickly and kind of move on. But the parties have to be there and essentially have a third party kind of push them through the door. I would think a good chunk of these types of cases that go to mediation are going to concern finance, money. Evictions, I don't think mediator can't handle something like that. The only one other issue is probably be habitability concerns, which I think is within the city's purview to handle. I think a voluntary mediation program that's non-binding would be a beneficial program that we could provide, that I would recommend, through a trained mediator, or even possibly if there's if we can outsource it to someone, to an organization that's already handling these types of issues. That's also something that the city should, I believe, consider.
So mandatory, non-binding, is that what you had said?
Non-mandatory, voluntary, and non-binding.
Any other comments?
One of the things that we had discussed at the last meeting that I mentioned was the credibility that we have with the code enforcement officers. When you look across the board here, you see, you know, one of the first items is rent increases. Well, if the rent increase is beyond 7%, or if it's beyond the 10%, whatever the 5 plus CPI is, without having to go through this mediation process, I mean, someone should be able to pick up the phone and say, I paid this much, I now pay this much, and someone should be able to respond back to the landlord saying, this is the criteria, this is in excess. Bringing 2 people in, taking all this time, I don't think, A, it requires that. So I think you have the ability with code enforcement officers to sit there, for instance, if that's an option, to have them do a quick look, do the quick math, there's a response that resolves your rent increase. If it's in excess of that, then perhaps the code enforcement office, I don't know if they have the ability to issue some sort of a correction notice. The next thing with regards to relocation fees, same thing. I'm just looking at the items that are listed here. Evictions, I don't think you can touch, because assuming once you use the word eviction, there's a judicial action that's been filed at that point. So that's going to run its course. And you also have situations where the parties may be represented by lawyers, and the lawyers have to agree, and it's not really left to the parties at that point. Habitability, again, you can start with a code enforcement officer, does a friendly visit rather than a citation visit. And I think if a code enforcement officer was to speak to a landlord and say, I believe this is a violation and I'm giving you 30 days, you know, get it fixed. And I've seen also code enforcement officers say, no, I'm closing this case, there's nothing there. So I think there's tools in place that number one, have credibility. Number two, it avoids the yelling match. Number three, when you say 90% are being initiated by the tenants, it's usually either because of money or conditions. That's it. With the landlords, I think one of the concerns that you're going to be dealing with is, if you're going to fix a roof, do you have rents coming in to fix a roof? Roofers today are not charging the same amount that they're charging in 2019. I guarantee you that. But for 3-4 years, the city of Los Angeles hasn't allowed a single rent increase. So you tell me why a landlord would be motivated to get their roof fixed when they have to pay higher costs for that type of stuff, and they haven't had that opportunity. So I think you have to stand back also and look at the big picture. So if we're going to create a mediation program, and in the city of Santa Monica, I have seen tenants use rent decrease applications abusively. There are situations where it's totally justified, but there's also those that go, I'm going to get a tenant-friendly hearing officer. I've had to go sit there with my client and listen to something that really didn't even need to, it was wasting everyone's time. So I think right now, the first question is, before we get to mediation, that's why I'm not for or against it. I think that the city of Glendale, with what the city has to offer and the staff that it already has the ability, I think with some fine tuning, to address these types of concerns and get rid of at least half of these items. I'd rather take the $100,000 and fix the guy's roof and keep them both happy, and, you know, take a couple bucks out of that and fix that, rather than spend it all on hiring all this stuff and wasting people's time. And if in fact the tenant is entitled to relocation, I would potentially use that money to help the tenant in that situation. But again, the idea here is trying to filter which cases can be resolved with the right staff that you already have, simple communication before it really gets to this, and then evaluate and see how many of those are resolved, and then to find out how many of the remaining ones are really done abusively. When you get 80 work orders from a tenant in a 2-bedroom apartment, there's a problem, okay? Either the tenant's a problem or that building is a complete mess. And if you have every other tenant in that building not submitting work orders, with the exception of that one, I think we can kind of understand where the problem's coming from. Likewise, if you have the remaining tenants in that building submitting multiple work orders, that's also obvious. So For me, the city and this whole idea was to simplify the process. If we have people already, bringing in a mediator is just going to be a reason to let people bring their arguments here and filter them out. Now, we can potentially incorporate a mediation option if this type of intervention has not resulted in some fruitful resolve. But I seriously think if a city inspector shows up and says, that electrical switch is messed up, and if I come back, I'm going to cite you for that, and that's a habitability issue, I would suspect that most reasonable landlords would respond to that favorably. So I don't want to bring more, unless it's absolutely necessary.
Well, what you said in the last part is true. I think that is what we're talking about, bringing the mediations as a last resort, sort of say. And I think just like this program, there's nothing wrong with trying a pilot program. I'm all for pilot programs and see where it takes us. In terms of the code enforcement, I can honestly say from experience, I don't think we should bank on that. These are departments that are burdened themselves. There's not enough staffing. The leniency that is given to owners, and look, I believe in we have to get people time to rectify a situation, absolutely. But are we following up? I'm even still questioning a situation that I know about. And this was 2 years ago, a person's been cited now. And actually, the issues are still there. So I think I agree the departments have to be tightened, but I think this is why we're here too. So many of the departments are burdened. There's no staffing. They're not on top of it like we would like to believe that they are and that there should be. And I know that 100% firsthand. I was, in that situation. And the landlords, some of the landlords that I was dealing with, even from GTU and helping tenants in crisis, were not concerned about it. Matter of fact, the harassment came more after the code enforcement was there. So to have some type of mediations and say, we just want to bring this together and help both parties, I think definitely helps. And we had a caller a while back, Justin, a tenant in crisis. We don't know what's happening with Justin.
Was that the one where he was living in the house? And yeah, I was wondering about that because I thought that we were told that since it's a single family,
right, so
city doesn't have much involvement or something. And
right, and thank you, Peter, for jumping in on this one. Like the tenant, I know someone up here, one of the members here had asked, well, why doesn't he just move? He actually did move because he felt his life was being threatened. Okay, but thank goodness he is still continuing on legally with his rights. But do we know if code enforcement followed up? We can't just keep having tenants move and then we go, okay, well, we don't have to do any more work. I don't know if they're following up. We don't have the information to see if they're fixing it. We can't keep putting Band-Aids on. And I remember a city council meeting. City council members talked about that too. Are we just giving these owners passes and saying, oh, okay, fix it whenever you get a chance? Certain things don't need past 3 months to get fixed. Certain things, let's just get it fixed within 30 days. I believe they do need that time for sure. So I think, again, this is where the mediations does help and help the city. I think we should be working with the city, not against for sure, just in conjunction with.
Can we also get the comments from both of you as to your preferences with regard to the mediation program?
Before we move on, we have 2 callers if we want to
Oh,
take
I
those
see.
first.
If we can, let's
Get those
continue with the
comments
committee
and then-
members, and then we can go to the public.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, from my side, my 2 cents will be like, I see this kind of application for that going on in Burbank, correct? So maybe we can do something like that. I don't want to say that it have to be volunteer or mandatory, because all the cases are different. If I'm gonna be a tenant who's being affected and I know that I'm gonna win, I'm gonna go even if it's mandatory or volunteer, I'm gonna go for. And I guess always it have to be the option for them to cross it out, you know? And biting or not biting, it have to be biting because otherwise there is no meaning of the spending time for everybody in this situation. That is my opinion.
May I ask for clarification? When we say that it's binding, does that mean that any agreement that's reached at the time of the mediation must go forward?
I think he can.
I do want to provide that clarification so we understand how mediation works. The two parties come together. There's a neutral person that offers the two parties to come together. It's not like an arbitrator or a judge that essentially defines what the law says and provides a legal conclusion and says you win and you lose. So in a mediation, the neutral person is suggesting to both sides to come to an agreement. And once they reach an agreement, they can agree, this is where the mandatory part comes in, they can agree at that point to reduce that agreement into a writing. And once they do that, that agreement then becomes a contract, and that contract is what becomes binding. So it's the, if either party does not perform the terms of the agreement that they have reached, let's say the agreement that they reach is that within 3 months the landlord will install a new air conditioner and the tenant will start immediately paying an extra $50 a month. They reduce that to writing. The tenant starts paying the $50. Now it's the third month and there's no air conditioner. And the landlord says, I'm not going to do it. I can't afford it anymore. I don't have the money for it. Binding means that at that point, the tenant may sue the landlord to enforce that agreement that they had reached. It doesn't involve the city doing something at that point.
It's interesting that all three of the cities, or all three of the examples are non-binding. Do you have a legal opinion as to why that would be? If
I don't have a legal opinion, but I could probably guess that it's because to go through the enforcement process of that agreement is also a costly endeavor. So they would have to file a lawsuit. They'd have to go through the whole process of litigation. That could take some time. It's not like, for example, unlawful detainer where there's an expedited process, or there used to be an expedited process. It's a lot slower now. So, trying to enforce a breach of contract claim in state court could take time and it could be costly.
And would they go to small claims court in that case if they were trying to enforce it, or?
If the dispute were monetary, potentially yes, and it would depend on the value.
Yeah.
They could go to small claims court. They can also get a declaratory judgment in small claims court, so that would probably be the easiest way to go.
I was just thinking it's interesting that all three of them are non-binding, and I didn't know the.
I mean, the logic is if you're going to go and you're going to sit there and you're going to try to participate, that it should be something that once it's done, binding almost makes sense. I agree with you. That's the logical way. But the problem is, Ms. Barpetian indicated, is okay. So one person blows it. Okay, how are you going to get them to do it? Now you're going to go through another process to make it, unless there's some interaction by the city at that point in time, which would then essentially, for like, if you had the ability, for instance, where if the tenant wasn't. Again, you can't do that. If the tenant wasn't paying, you could force them to pay impound rents. Likewise, if the landlord doesn't perform, it's a habitability. You have something like you have with the City of LA with the REAP program, where the rents then the tenant would pay into the city, assuming you've got violations of habitability. Those are the kind of the crutches that are used to keep people honest. That way, if the tenant is withholding rent improperly and the city says, okay, if you're right, you get it back, but you got to deposit it, then we'll know at that point in time if the tenant really has it first, And then secondly, it kind of cuts through the rest of the molasses to say, okay, how important is it for them to see if this is worth the fight too? So yeah, I mean, that's the kind of the rub why other cities are able to kind of get that across. City of LA and City of Santa Monica have a totally different structure.
The other part of it is, even if it's drafted as if it's not binding, the parties at that point can agree before they get started that they will reduce it to writing and they will sign an agreement. And that agreement will ultimately, so if the city doesn't, if the recommendation, if we can't agree here that it should be binding, it would just be a voluntary process. And, you know, two parties come in because they're willing to have the discussion and they don't want to be bound by the outcome. They could do it that way, or the mediator right at the outset could offer them, you're going to spend 3 hours here today. Do you want us to reduce the agreement to writing and then be bound by it? So they could do it at that point too, but it would not be, it could be set up so it's an option once the parties get to the mediator versus mandating that it be binding right off the get-go.
Yeah, I like that idea as well. Because, you know, at least mandatory, we have to get them there. If you do mandatory, to say non-binding doesn't make sense, because you had to, because you're there, you know, that's the first step. You have to get there. So mandatory, yes, to get there. And then I like your idea that can be an agreement that it is non-binding or not at that time.
So before we move on to the callers, if everyone can fill this out either today or sometime in the future, we're going to use this as the template to go back to council with, 5 committee members said they want voluntary, mandatory, so we have something to go back to council with.
I just caution us that this is a public meeting. This is not a secret vote. I would really appreciate it if we're doing this for the sake of convenience. After you check off these items, if you could just say, number 1, I'm picking, voluntary, number 2, et cetera, and just go down the list. Because it can't be a...
We can bring back the results next week when everybody, or next month when everybody else.
I think we've pretty much heard where everyone's going with it. So if we could just get the final comments. I think we've got one more comment here.
Okay, okay. I'm frankly, I'm kind of torn, I have to say, but I guess I would say mandatory, non-binding to start. Ability to appeal, yes. Since the budget factor for either trained media or outsourcing seems to be the lowest dollar figure, maybe that would be an interesting place to start, but I also think it would be interesting and educational for the community to have a commission do it. I don't know about formal, informal. I'm not sure exactly what that means exactly. Is that meaning like you get together and meet, or someone calls, or?
Right. For formal and informal, formal I would describe as, both parties meet, some kind of a setting. Informal would be calling them, saying, hey, just similar to the Burbank situation where we were informing them.
Maybe we could have a mix, like Victor was saying, certain things could just be handled with a phone call or something like that.
Right.
And then, I guess I did like what Victor was saying too about some of these things maybe could be resolved in different ways, so. But I also want both sides to feel like they have a place to reach out for a neutral opinion. So I guess maybe it would be almost all of these. As far as exemptions, given that, a lot of the habitability complaints we've been hearing in this committee have come from single family. I sort of feel like it should apply to all rental properties.
All right.
Am I next? Am I next? Okay, again, I want to preface with, I really would like to get city involvement on the basic stuff, relocation amounts, rent increase amounts, those types of things, I think would be very helpful and quickly resolved. I think the most need, I'm just going to jump to number 6 for a second, where I think that this type of a program would be helpful, extremely helpful, security deposits. There's already been a break of the relationship, so it's pretty straightforward math at that point in time. And you've got pictures that do the talking more than the people at that stage. You need estimates and things like that that are already set forth by the code. So I think any mediator should be able to move through that pretty easily. Habitability concerns, reduced amenities, I think those definitely should be as part of a mediation program, because if a code inspector has come out and said something and you don't, then that would go to my next step, which is to bring the mediation in if the code enforcement representative is being ignored. Reduced amenities, definitely, I think so, because that takes into consideration potential retaliatory actions that are taken. Why take away someone's parking if you don't have to? Or get rid of a pet just because it's been there all this time. So I think that's a pretty obvious no-brainer that once you're in this environment, you can kind of cut through the fluff. Rent decrease, I don't think it applies to us because we're not in a rent control situation.
It's a question I was going to bring up as well, so can we clarify that? Since there's no rent control in Glendale, there's no ability to ask for a rent reduction and mediate that.
I mean, you could always ask for a rent reduction.
You can ask, but
Yeah.
I don't think that should be, I think that's where, and I've seen, unfortunately, the rent reduction situations have the potential for being abusive too. So that I would rather let the kind of the free market determine that, because if people think they can get a better deal down the street, they'll just get up and move. Relocation fees, that could obviously be something that, with all the funky formulas we've got here, you may need some help deciphering that. Repairs in the rental units, I think that kind of ties in with habitability. I've seen complaints about a cutting board doesn't slide, believe it or not. So I think that could be resolved with that. Rent increases and the other ones I think are pretty straightforward. So I think once we've had that first line, if that can't be resolved, then if mediation is something that they both want to attend and it's voluntary, then I would support it. I think that having it binding, while there may be an issue like we talked about where there's some difficulty in getting it enforced, there's a psychological element to it. I think that with most people seeing that they've got a understanding that they have a binding agreement, that most will probably follow through understanding that that's what they've agreed to. You're going to have a few that are going to drift off, but I think that also will lend to people participating in good faith rather than just blowing it off, because I think they have an interest in it at that point. Ability to appeal, I would say no. I think it's, unless you're talking about appealing to a court, but if there's another agency within the city you're going to apply to, or another mediator, I think that's going to be just a way to rehash people that got decisions that they weren't happy with, or an agreement that they weren't happy, or they thought about, or their friend says, that's stupid. I just told the guy to get out and the guy left, or whatever. And they're saying, you know what, I'm going to go appeal that then and see if I can, or potentially I could see a landlord using an appeal as a way to harass the tenant as well, make them come back now that, you did this. So I would think an appeal is going to be a waste. Who to have the mediation performed by? Experience. Someone with experience. I don't care if it's a nonprofit, a commission, a mediator, a superior court judge, just someone that understands the dynamics of these things, because I think where your mediation in any city will be fruitful is when you have someone that says, okay, I understand the sides, let me lead you to the resolution. If you guys can't reach it, I need to lead you, and that only comes with experience. Because you know what the dynamics are. You know when the landlord's just trying to do it to get more rent. You know when the tenant's just being difficult. You know when there's a genuine dispute. And I think that people with experience that do this, you know, we've settled over 10,000 eviction cases, I think, in the court hallways. You know, you just know where it is. And I think you need someone that has the ability to put their finger on that pulse. As far as what type of property, I think if we're gonna have a just cause ordinance that deals with, 3 or more, I think we leave it in 3 or more. If it doesn't deal with the single family or the duplexes, I wouldn't bring those into it. I don't see why you would. Because you're also dealing with homes in the city of Glendale that could be anywhere from a couple $1,000s up to, you know, 15, 20,000, if depending on the size of the property. You really want to now bring all of those people in here, and I think you just go with what's already
If
in.
they're renting them out and they don't have the same regulations, it's just, it feels like there's a lot of
Well, I mean, if the
taking
city,
advantage in those situations.
if the city council originally was focusing on enacting an ordinance that dealt with a particular classification of tenancy, which is a property that has 3 or more units, then I think we limit it to that, because otherwise, if you're gonna do this to everything, then you'd have to do that. Why wouldn't you do that to everything? I mean, I think that was the targeted area of concern. So why not just be consistent? That's all. Just simple consistency for me.
Just that with regard to single-family homes, because the state regulated that, the city was preempted from regulating it. And I can't speak to why it was. Duplexes were not included. I mean, I know the rationale that the committee considered in exempting duplexes as well. But at least with single-family homes, the reason those were exempted from the code is that the city would be preempted from doing that by state law.
Right.
As it relates to those types of regulations, but not as it relates to participating in a mediation program to resolve a dispute. So for example, some cities have, you know, an ombudsperson or a mediation program for neighbor disputes. They've got, you know, a tree limb or, you know, excessive dog barking situation. That's not regulated by state law, so the city would not be exempt from regulating that. So that would be up for the committee to discuss. I mean, that's essentially what I'm saying.
You want to go?
So I would say mandatory. Now the outcome between the non-binding and binding, your idea is not on here, so I don't know if that would fall under non-binding, possible agreement. So I would go with that. Ability to appeal, I agree, no. You definitely need someone trained in mediations, but I do think somewhere the commission should be still embedded in this as well. Like I said, even if it's as just a pilot program, because this is what we're here for, and I believe this was part of this commission getting together. The mediations was somewhat embedded in here as a need or a want from the architecture of this committee. So then the hearing, again, I'm kind of baffled with what the formal and informal means as well.
So informal would be something, let's say you get, formal would be something you have a mediator sitting down with both tenants and landlords, and they show their evidence, discuss the case, something like that. Whereas informal would be a staff member contacting the landlord, asking him questions about the situation, contacting the tenant versus bringing him in, having them.
Got you,
Go through an
okay.
entire
So
process.
informal.
And maybe I can add a little bit to the formal versus informal. Typically, in a hearing setting in a city context, what you will see is a requirement of submitting written documents, submitting, I don't want to call it a written brief, but it could be a written brief, at least a written narration of your situation, along with documentation, an opportunity for one side or the other side, usually controlled by time, that you're supposed to submit documents within a certain period of time. That would be probably at the most extreme side of a formal, and then informal would be sort of what Mr. Zadorian was describing, which you could get information over the phone, could verify. You don't have to swear in witnesses, those types of things.
Okay, got it, thank you. So informal with that. The type of disputes, I agree with all except for the evictions. And in terms of habitability, I don't know if that would include if someone becomes disabled and needs some adjustments to their accommodations to their place. So I would definitely include that. And no exemption.
And I do also want to comment on the appeal question. This is limited to appealing to another city body, not the right to appeal to the court. So we're discussing whether or not, after the mediator makes a decision, whether or not that should get appealed to a commission or to the council, to the city manager, those types of appeals versus whether they can appeal to a court. That's not on the table because they can.
Well, let me ask you this, though, because obviously with the mediation, the mediator is essentially just facilitating the agreement. So it's not like an arbitration where the mediator's role is to make a definitive decision. It's just, you agree to this, back and forth. Okay, so we now have a consensus, right? There's a decision made, or at least an embodiment of what they've agreed to. So why would you even want to suggest an appeal to that? It's almost like you're baiting people to want to go back on their word, because these are two people that, if they, hypothetically, if it's voluntary and then they agree, if they agree that it's going to be binding, we've bound ourselves. Now, why give me a chance to appeal or change it?
Someone may want to argue process. Someone may want to argue, my evidence was not properly considered.
But it's a mediation, though. It's a conversational setting. It's not a okay, call your first witness scenario.
Right, so that's what you're discussing. I'm not advocating for it to be there or not be there. I'm just saying that that's what it means.
Yeah,
It's
I mean,
not-
obviously the mediation is to keep it as an open communication forum where hopefully the three people with the assistance of whomever may be assisting gets them both across the same finish line. And they agree that this is now our new finish line. So once they've got that clear, if you don't pay for if you don't fix the air conditioning, using your example, after 3 months, the tenant is going to withdraw the $50 that they're paying at that point. Or they can withdraw not only the 50, they get another 100 on top of that. Whatever that deal is at that stage, then the only thing is the only thing you would potentially appeal in that scenario is if someone was to say, I did fix it. And the tenant says, no, it doesn't work. So it's, perhaps a discretionary review is, to make sure that the parties did do what they said they were going to do. That might be the best thing rather than calling it an appeal. Just an idea, but.
I agree.
Well, for me, like I said, mandatory and binding, because that prevent of us to waste time and resources. And the ability to appeal is kind of undecided, because what he just said, I could say no at this point. Mediation performed by commission or board, I suggest retired lawyer, so we don't spend that much money, and they have large experience, and I see so many of them available. Also, it could be a law student as well when they are less busy with their getting their degree or finish their studies. So that could be a very good opportunity for them to come and have those hours that sometimes is so hard for them to apply in the real market for a job later because they don't have any experience. So this could be a very good opportunity for them and for us that we are limited always on resources, you know. In the number 6 type of disputes, I'm very fine with everything unless habitability concerns, because I think this one is gonna take us to other departments to be involved. So it's the only thing that we could mention it, they can fill up the application and everything, but we can forward it to the correct department. And for me, number 7 is the first one, non-exception, because sometimes, like he mentioned it, we don't want to go into the big houses that they are renting, they're paying a lot of money, and we don't want to get that big amount of people to can come and do the same mediation, looking for the mediation. But we don't have in here the rent registry. Rent registry could be a very good provider of data. How many houses do we have in Glendale? How much money did they pay every single month? So we can have an idea. Okay, right now at this point, we don't want all the houses in Glendale that is being rented for families to be in this group. But at the same time, I could say if we have this information, we could say, okay, houses, single family houses that they are paying rent up to $6,000, just to say something kind of modest, for a regular family. I see that a lot of houses in Glendale, there are 3 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms and a half, goes 5,500. And even though a family can afford to rent that, but they're renting between students, 3 people, 3 party, and each pay $2,000 a month. It's kind of like they could go and rent an apartment. 1-bedroom apartment right now is $1,800, $1,900. And they want to have more privacy. They don't want to be in a building, so that's why a lot of people, they are renting houses, 3-bedroom houses, and they live together. It could be co-workers, it could be students, relative, but the same age, pretty much. That is my personal opinion. Thank you.
All right.
I'll make this quick. I know we still have the callers. Quick question though, before I get to it. Outside vendors, what types of organizations did you look at any?
There were specific organizations that dealt with mediation, all types of mediation, and landlord-tenant disputes were part of their process. One of them was called SEED.
Do you know if they provide like Zoom mediation, or do tenants and landlords have to, drive downtown or a specific location?
I guess that's something we would have to look into more detail, but I did see that they provided online, some of them did, at least.
I mean, if that's an option, I think it would be a very convenient option to put 2 parties together to get something resolved. I would, highly lean towards, outsourcing it just to get a feel if tenants and landlords in Glendale are even up for this kind of program to be offered, and then down the line, if need be, we can expand and bring it internally. So I'm going to stick with a voluntary non-binding mediation that is either through the city board, but probably prefer an outside organization. Ability to appeal, I'm a no. Formal process, and then as far as number 6, I would kind of stick with the rent increases, security deposit, repairs, relocation fees, and I would not exempt. So it applies at least because it's a voluntary and non-binding. My suggestion is voluntary and non-binding. I would say anybody who wants to can participate.
All right. Thank you, everyone. We have 2 callers and 1 speaker in person.
Herbert Milano, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. Members of this commission and city staff, I want to tell you that I'm speaking to you from about 37 years of experience as a landlord. And I have hundreds of tenants and resolved all of my issues, and I have not evicted anyone. I stated this before, but I have a suggestion that I think has not been considered, and that is that if there is going to be any type of mediation program, that it be started as non-mandatory for at least 1 year, and so that the data can be collected with regard to the types of issues that are being presented, the types of solutions that have worked, and also we need to measure some level of success, because to me the success is that the tenant remained and that they're happily, should we say, cohabiting in their building if the landlord lives in the building. In the other cases where the tenant is evicted, that is another measure of, let's say, failure, right? That the mediation did not work. But we need to have a measure of success defined beforehand. And then an evaluation as to how the people were trained with regard to the mediators, how the program is being established, and what does the data tell us afterwards? How big are the different problems with regard to the claims that are being made? I think that we need to be very careful with regard to people coming into this program with certain ideologies or preconceptions as to what a landlord is, right? Or what a particular tenant is. This COVID situation that we had demonstrated to landlords significantly how fragile the situation is for many people with regard to income, but also how fragile the mental state of people is when they are under stress. So oftentimes, many of these programs, from my experience, can be solved, but not necessarily by the parties that are confronting each other, which means that the people who are the mediators need to be fully trained, need to be sometimes like marriage counselors, individuals who understand the psychology and the dynamics of interpersonal relationships. But without an evaluation afterwards that tells us this is what we have learned, this is how we need to improve it, this is what the data tells us, and then decide whether or not it is truly justified to continue with a program like this that is mandatory. Thank you.
Thank you. Alex Hakimian, you're on the air. You have 2 minutes. Alex, are you there? I think we lost him. We have one speaker, Karen Kwok.
Hi, I'm Karen Kwok. I was not planning to talk today, just to listen, but I believe I have information that is not yet widely known. Yesterday, the City Council held a special meeting at 9 a.m. and then around 2 p.m. to decide their priorities for the coming year. And they were asked to select their 4 top areas of priority. And although it did not make the final 4, code enforcement was actually on the list as one of the 9 that they could choose from. Because code enforcement has been so problematic throughout the city that it definitely requires special attention. So I would actually not rely on code enforcement to resolve a lot of these issues. Number 2, they very specifically brought up, precisely because city staff is so burdened, that they would be delighted if some of their city commissions could actually take on some of the work of the city staff, because that would relieve the pressure. That basically give more work to our city commissions, and you were an example of that, so that our city staff, don't feel the entire pressure by themselves. So the city council would actually be delighted if you would take on some of their duties. Okay, number 2, in terms of mediation, I actually had that exact discussion with Mr. Arnajarian when I proposed this idea to him about 2 years ago. And I had the exact same conversation that you mentioned, Mr. Arpetian, about mediation versus arbitration. I actually imagined that this body would actually be the one hearing the cases. So I don't understand this talk of hiring an outside mediator. And I'm actually thinking about other city commissions. I actually don't, it doesn't matter to me at all whether it's a mediation process or an arbitration, as long as we have some form to resolve these issues, these tenant-landlord issues. Because an example is the Design Review Board, that they actually make binding decisions. And they very often boil down to neighbors disputing, basically 2 homeowners disputing. It very often goes, one homeowner says, I want to do this, and the neighbor says, I don't want you to do that. And if one of those parties does not like the decision made by the design review board, then they can appeal it, and the body that will hear that appeal is actually the full city council. They have mentioned this quite often, that they serve as a quasi-judicial body. And I cannot tell you the number of design review cases I've sat through, and I can't help thinking, this is a privilege homeowners have that tenants and landlords don't. All I'm asking you to do is to level the playing field so that tenant-landlord issues can get the same equal footing to be heard by the city that property owners, homeowners already have. Because we are, after all, the majority of the city, and our issues deserve to get heard in exactly the same way as property owners. In terms of whether it's binding, I believe that the ideas you already discussed, that if we want to prevent this from becoming a forum where people just yell at each other in public, that we want to make sure that these people are coming to us in good faith because they actually want a solution, then it is actually necessary to make it binding. And I'm totally open to pilot programs. In fact, this body is itself a pilot program of 1 year. Let's see how it works and adjust it as needed to see what works and what does not. And also, a very specific case I brought up, I hear about a lot of cases that courts of law never hear, because and the way I discussed it with Mr. Arnajarian, who was an attorney, is that I do not expect this body to be a replacement for a court of law, not in any way, shape, or form. For example, with eviction cases, that's clearly a legal process that needs to be dealt with by the courts. However, I'm going to point out that it's a gray area, that when tenants get a 3-day notice from a landlord, they often think it's the start of the eviction process. It is not. And so they might think it's an eviction, and so they might come to you saying it's an eviction case, but it is actually necessary to listen to what is actually happening and to ask to see the documentation, to see what the actual concerns are. And finally, I can discuss a lot of cases that we as tenant advocates at the Glendale Tenants Union here and never make it to a court of law, but just one that I heard from a tenant directly is that it was a nuisance case, as you mentioned, tenant versus tenant. That there was this tenant called me saying that a neighbor upstairs was deliberately leaving her television on when just before she left the apartment, precisely to irritate her neighbor. And this happened over and over again until it became obvious it was deliberate. And she said that she called the police 12 times. So I asked her, what did the police tell her when they showed up 12 times? She said nothing, because they can't do anything about it. And at some point, the first thing I told her to do is, you know what, stop calling the police, because that's actually a waste of city resources. And how many times do you need to be told that they can't do anything to solve this problem? So number one, if we don't pay for it in one way, the city will pay for it in another way. That always happens. So
That's time.
That was our funding. Okay, one last point. Okay, and the thing is, the easiest thing for the landlord in this case to do is just to evict both tenants, right? Because they're both causing problems. He doesn't care which one's causing the problem, just evict them both. So that's actually an example of the kind of case I would like to be heard by this body. That if all three parties in good faith want to reach a solution, the landlord and both tenants, then can we give them a forum to reach solution to these types of problems before it becomes an even bigger issue, not just a legal case, but for the city, like for the police department as a whole. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen.
Right.
Any other thoughts based on the comments you heard, or are we done with this?
Agreed. Agreed and understood.
Okay.
Next item on the agenda is discussion on application fees, application process fees. This would be when a tenant wants to apply to take an available unit. Landlord charges application processing fee. City council asked the committee to discuss this, see if there was anything that we could potentially do about excessive application processing fees. The floor is yours.
This was brought up at a council meeting.
Last month, I believe.
Right, and the speaker had talked about application fees in the amount of $150, $160, and that by virtue of making something that high, that itself could start screening out tenants unfairly. And so that's why council had asked that this maybe be looked at by the committee. I'm just wondering how many of you either charge or have been charged an application fee when renting?
We charge $30 per adult, and I will say that in the last probably 3 to 5 years, almost every single employment verification of any company of any size, you have to pay, actually, you have to either subscribe to a service or you have to pay $34 to get the employment verification. So we're still charging only the $30, but the costs of the screening process have gone up significantly.
What does that involve?
The companies have outsourced to, mostly it's a thing called the work number, and you just simply cannot verify an employee's employment without going through that process. You know, and some people may collect pay stubs. We have had significant experience of fake pay stubs in the past, which is why we separately verify the employment. But that's become, you know, much more expensive.
So $30 per adult in the household applying?
Yeah.
And then if that covers an employment check per se, then what do you do about credit and all that?
Well, we're technically losing money on those ones. Because then the credit check is $11 plus.
Does every employer participate in that process, or is it?
It's, at first it was only the biggest companies, and it seems to be growing and growing to many, many companies.
Do you have examples or cases where or applicants have said, you know, I really can't afford this $30 per person type of thing?
Not that I'm aware of, but.
And you only collect, how would you collect that? If you narrow it down to 10 applicants, would you collect on the 10? If you narrowed it down to 2, or the one that you're really interested in, then you'll ask?
Whoever has a completed application form, we only collect it for them. And because for fair housing rules, we have to go with the first completed application. We can't just collect from everyone and say, oh, by the way, this one looks better, you know. So we go through the process with the first group or person, and then if they're not approved, we move to the next completed application. And then if we don't, and then if they withdraw their app, or they decide they don't want the place, we always refund the money. I don't think everybody does that, but that's what we do.
Are there other fees other than the employment one that you described?
For us?
For a credit check?
The credit check is $11 per for us. And then our staff time working on it.
And I'm sorry, did you say that for those that you don't consider but have submitted a payment, you refund those?
Sometimes they change their mind. I guess it's the ones who just change their mind. We'll refund it.
But if you've taken fees for 5 people, 5 households, let's say, or you're only taking it per house.
We don't.
So
We
you'll
only
just take it, the first one you receive, you say, okay, where's your application fee? Pay it, yes or no, and then you move on to the next one.
Yeah.
And then is that, how is that payment? Is it just check? Or is it money order?
The credit check has to be cash or money order for us.
Interesting.
And then a holding deposit is.
I could say that her company is one of the best old-fashioned good company. It used to be like that, $15, $25, and then when they have already 2 application or 3 application that it look good already, they don't keep receiving more application and collecting. But there is some other people that they use and abuse as well for this in this matter, and they don't ask for 25 or 30. They ask for $50 and $100. And it goes on the tenants. So that's what I was telling the other day. Why, when we go in and applying other places for anything, they take the expenses as a part of the business, running business. You know what I mean? As a part of the expenses for their business. So this is a business for them. So what happened over here is that before it was like one manager in the building, he was the one who was doing all these things. So that's why they didn't charge more. But now that it's always a middleman who does this business, renting for the owner those units, so they have to make a living too from us. So that is the way that we need to stop and say it, no more than this, or up to 3 application that it look decent. You don't have to keep collecting other application, because even in me, when I'm going and look for apartment, when I see one that I like it's not guaranteed 100% that I'm gonna receive the phone call that approve my application. But at the same time, I have to move and I have to see 1, 2, 3, because I don't wanna end up on the street. So this is the perspective from the tenants too. So
You've had cases where you've had multiple applications submitted, and as a result, you had
Yes.
multiple payments for
exactly.
application fees?
Yes. And if we are 3, my 18, 19 years old, he have to pay too. Even he doesn't have credit, because what is 18? Oh, because he's over 18, he have to pay.
What's the highest amount you've had to pay?
50. The last one that $50 for each.
Yeah, I've seen between 30, 35 up to, I think from what I've heard, 75. But that also takes into consideration, you have the office will have its own administrative charge for the person to have to sit there and process the application. There's also a fee with whoever the vendors are that will provide you with a credit report. Then there's extra add-ons for employment verification. I think nowadays, given the fact that management companies are seeing courts are more likely to seal unlawful detainer records, there's a little bit more time spent, whereas before it was, hey, where was your prior address? Who was the prior landlord? I think now there's a lot more follow-through with that. There's more time spent saying, how did that last tenancy end? Was it as a result of an eviction? Did they give you a 30-day notice? Did they leave without a notice? Did you relocate them? Did you whatever? So I think that seems to be the more approach. But usually if you're dealing with a completed application, that everything is there and the score checks out, I think most of the time landlords are, they'll just go with what's there at that point and try to get the place rented to minimize vacancy loss. They're not necessarily out there fielding a bunch of people. The only exception you could potentially see is maybe in some situations where if people have pets, some landlords may be a little bit squeamish. But if it's a qualified animal, emotional service animal, that's different. Some of the forms allow you to identify that. Others just, I got 4 cats and I'm bringing them with me. Some owners aren't exactly looking for that type of an arrangement. But usually, the other thing too that I've seen is if the applicant is denied the unit because of anything usually other than credit, that usually there's a refund also. I know we've done that in the past many times. So if, let's say, the person says, I've got 4 cats, but their credit comes out great. Are any of the cats because of an emotional service? Well, it's a no pet building, sorry. They'll refund the application fee back to that individual. I've seen that a lot too.
Legally, they could have kept it?
I don't know if they could have kept it or not. Because you just, I think for the most part, again, if you deny it because, you've got a 200 credit score, I'm sorry, that doesn't fly, then the charge of, the leading charge for the fee is, let's get the credit score in first, and then it justifies usually the follow-up after that. So I think that's how most companies will see, because usually when you pull up these reports, the credit score is like one of the first things that pops up, and that's like the quick, easy, quick and dirty. You see 760, you're dealing with, okay, let's keep reading. If you see, 230, you're pretty much done at that point in time, because you're going to see a bunch of negative indications after that, and who wants to be the next creditor that's not being paid. But if everything were to check out, and you denied them because of anything other than credit, usually most will refund the fee.
And the highest amount you said you've
I've seen
clients who-
75 only because they start, I mean, I've heard it from some management companies just because that they're, you know, that's their administrative fee.
75.
Yeah, but I would think 35 to 50 is probably par for the course right now. Yeah.
Okay.
What I'm concerned about are the landlords or owners taking deposits just randomly, though. I know that can happen. I mean, we can't police everything, you know. I understand that. But I didn't know, like, I do know some people will say, some landlords will say there is an application already on file, you know, but they, like, I think.
And then they take a second deposit?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think that's, you don't think you're supposed to do that.
So, yeah. And, yeah.
Yeah, my understanding of fair housing is you've got to finish the one that you've got, because then you could be discriminating against that person by thinking you have a better one that's next.
Exactly. And I,
Depends if it's a completed application, though, because sometimes some people will leave information out.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
and
if it's
then
not complete.
I'll get it to you, you know.
If it's
name
not
of-
complete, then you're not starting on, yeah. I mean,
okay.
Sometimes that they'll, you know, leave the names of occupants off the list, and some landlords will also cross-reference the name of occupants against Megan's laws to see if whether or not the occupant has any sort of, you know, history, criminal history.
But you can't decline for that.
You can't decline for that, but, you know, obviously at some point in time, they're doing their full due diligence to know who they're bringing in and, you know, who their occupants are. Because the other thing too is it's also not uncommon for people to come in and all of a sudden the occupant somehow switches out and someone else comes in. So, you know.
How do you know if a landlord is not just collecting more than one application fee from different people?
Vacancy loss. Because the goal of most
you're assuming-
landlords is they want to fill the vacancy because
Most legal
well, I mean,
landlords.
You know, if you're dealing with, let's say, a unit that's renting for, say, $2,500 in the city of Glendale, divide that by 30. Every day that unit sits vacant,
No, I understand.
the landlord is racking things up. So for them, and don't forget, in order to get an application, you usually have to show the unit or make it available. So now you have to, if you have one application, and what are you going to go meet another person, show them the unit just to get an application from them? Probably not. If your first person is ready to go, and you can
understand.
minimize the vacancy loss, you're just going to say, wonderful, I got the full app, let's run with it, and go, you know, and go ahead and get the rental
I'm wondering
agreement
if
signed.
everyone, especially with quote unquote the illegal rentals, if everyone is even, if those type of landlords are even doing credit checks. Now that
Well,
I'm
and you
thinking about
you
it.
can't do the credit check unless they've given you the authorization. Or they have to sign, they have to give you authorization to run your credit. You can't just run it because they gave you a deposit or something like that. I mean, whether or not everyone's following those rules, that's, I think, what you're saying.
Yeah, that's what now that I'm sitting here thinking, you know, because obviously we've talked about the illegal rentals. We've had people here talking about the illegal rentals. And, you know, so going back to the main thing, the application process, you said city council was just trying to understand our view on the application. You know, obviously we have to pay an application. I mean, you do all these fees come into if you're buying a home as well. So I don't have a problem with that. I just need it to be clear and concise of what I'm doing. And I think, you know, even from the landlord's point of view, whether it's, I
150
haven't had issues with application fees, but I know others have.
But if 150 is high, I think that's pretty high up there. I mean, I'd like to know how much work are they doing and exactly what are they, you know.
Right.
And I think that
That's
should be
just
clear.
because again, in the day and age now of automation, obviously with your regular, say, say, mom and pop landlord, they may or may not incorporate a full, most of them will have a phone subscription to, like, they'll call like the AOA, for instance. You can get a credit check if you're a member with them. But a lot of the other management companies, go on the website, it's all done on the phone now. Type in your name, you can attach your driver's license, you could, do all this other stuff, and you check the box, I'm authorizing blah, 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 put in your credit card, and then submit, and it's done.
But you also have to do the identity theft verification,
Right.
proof of identity. You don't want someone applying as somebody else. So there's a lot of that. And then we actually do call the landlords. There's phone calls that are still the prior landlord, and
No, you have to nowadays.
Wow. Dwight,
You have to.
anything? Any experience or?
I mean, the only other thing I could think of that's probably equivalent would be, buying a car. You don't really have fees galore when you're submitting an application to purchase a car. My take is that something like an application for housing should be part of business cost. I mean, if I am opening up this unit or selling this product or selling this service, then it's just a part of the business. That's what the cost of running that place is. Just like having lights in the common areas.
Yeah, but why do restaurants charge a gratuity if you're a party of 6 or more?
But it's not mandatory, you know that? You can refuse, yeah. Some people, they don't know.
But they assess that, right? I mean, it's one of those things that I think there's obviously good reasons why, one way or another.
Well, I mean, restaurant aspect of it, it's 6 or more because there's more work to be done at that one table by one server, but like a house.
And also too, they make minimum wage, they don't make more than that. So if the rent is could be 900 forever, I'm gonna pay my,
No, I
My
agree with you.
check.
I agree, but that's what I'm saying is that there's arguments for both sides. I mean, there's good rationale. The only thing is I think that when the ability to access the information comes at a cost to the landlord, because if they're trying to verify credit and credit worthiness, obviously all they're doing is passing the cost along. Now, whether or not the city council wants to allow that or not, that passage of cost over, I think that needs to be a policy decision that the city council should look at and say, should this be a
what
a cost
about
that gets
now
passed to the consumer?
now that we have one-time free credit report a year, correct?
A
So
free
if
credit report, yeah.
If somebody wants to move, maybe this is a good opportunity to exercise that and get my own credit report at the time that I'm gonna move and be a part of my application. If I'm gonna apply here and there, and let's see who they can approve, because they have different criterias for, like he said, no pets allowed. I have to pay the last time that I moved 10 years ago, all $800 for deposit for my pet. Yeah, which one? I was happy because I know how I treat my pet, but other people I saw when they are showing apartment after the pet really destroyed the apartment, it's so sad to see those apartments too. So we need to be in both sizes at the same time.
But that's a great point. See, some owners will accept the person that shows up and says, here's my free credit report. There are also owners that say, how do I know that that's
Right.
real? How do
Goes
I know
back to the
that's
question
legit?
of verifying if it's
You can put anything on a computer nowadays and manipulate it, you know.
Credit Karma.
yeah,
It's not even,
yeah.
You
wouldn't
say
believe some of the-
Transamerica, I have to say the Equifax and things like that, right? And
But they
it
could
has a
have put a
number.
little Equifax on something else, on somebody else's
No, give me-
report, or, I mean,
I've heard examples of fake pay stubs.
No, if you-
yeah,
if you-
and they get the company logo. I mean, they're really, you would never know it was fake.
I think if you scan a report into like an Adobe format and you have like the higher versions of Adobe, you can do text recognition and start swapping numbers out. No, I don't think anyone's ever gonna notice.
Yeah, I'm sure.
I was also thinking about, it's kind of similar to like, you have to pay a setup fee when you get your utilities started in your name. It's kind of like, almost like a setup fee.
Yeah, how about that
Because
one?
that's that additional work required, with the city, even tenants have to pay that. for
Deposit fee.
On this particular issue, I think we're going to go back and take a closer look at California Civil Code 1950.6, which I think by and large regulates a lot of what we've been discussing. What I'm not seeing in the code is the enforcement. So if there is a violation of that code section, you're not even a tenant at that point. You're a prospective tenant. What are you going to do to collect the fee? So in my sort of quick review of this, I don't see an enforcement mechanism, which is something that I think we need a little more time to look at, but something that we can all, I think, maybe take a look at.
I'd also like to see, Sipan, if you can have staff take a look and maybe survey a few of the property management companies, just to ask if their practices are fees, and if yes, what are the amounts? And maybe survey a few tenants that you've dealt with over time and ask about their experiences with it. It's very interesting. And then, did I hear correctly when you said that you can do a Megan Law check, and did I hear that you can't use that against a...
You cannot.
You can disclose it. I think you can disclose it, right?
That it came up, or that?
I think I'm not sure, but I think you can.
I was under the impression that that cannot be a factor in denying the
Cannot be a
application.
factor in denying, but I think it can be, I think it's something where I'm not sure on how you can use the information.
Oh, yeah. But I think we have to tell all the tenants that they have the right to look.
Yeah, they have the right to look and all of that stuff too, yes. Mhm. I'm not 100% on that.
No, it's very
But
interesting.
some people just want to, again, they want to get to know who their tenants are, and even with people that will have out-of-state addresses, you're seeing nowadays that landlords are following up and seeing what the rules and the laws in that state are to make sure that the tenant terminated the tenancy according to whatever the provisions are that they have there.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Okay, well, it's given us some information, and questions, so I think we'll come back, and as Lucy had mentioned, we'll take a look at it from the law side as well, and see if we can come back with more information.
Committee Minute, Jennifer, I want to ask, do you think it's ridiculous, or does this happen as well, if the application fee, once approved, can be deducted from the rent for that first month? Does that happen?
Well,
Would that not make sense?
in our case, it may not make sense when, in our case, that fee goes to our company as opposed to the property owner, because we're the ones that are doing the work. So if it's two entities like that, it's kind of different, but.
Even though about the deposit over here, security deposit, sometimes people, they live for 10 years. It's a security deposit, it was $1,000. Do you put in any account that it gain any interest?
We don't in the city of Glendale. In city of LA, you are required to.
Yeah, you see, and then that's why sometimes I see in the end of the 5 years, 10 years, they're gonna move into a 2 bedrooms instead 1 bedroom. So what they always have to collect the cleaning, and they put cleaning like $250 to $300 cleaning, beside when you have to paint and all the stuff like that. But it's kind of like they gain some interest from the deposit, and now on the top they're gonna collect $300 for cleaning. When 10 years it was a business for you guys. I mean, I try to negotiate now not to.
We don't have an
not to
automatic
burn a lot to
cleaning
the
charge at my
tenants.
company, so I can't really speak to that. I mean,
Okay.
I know some people do that, but.
I mean, I think it just, honestly, these fees are just, it's a unfortunate culture change where they're just not, it's not only in the housing industry, it's also in the airline industry, and it's also in the, banking, and it just, it's a nice little loophole that they can, in these industries can get, that they could put in just to avoid, housing regulations or all kinds of other regulations. I mean, I think now I'm hearing there's trash fees at some of these buildings that they're adding on to rent. So, I mean,
Yeah. Well, it certainly has gotten more complicated and convoluted for the process, so I can understand saying we need some of these checks and balances and these costs, and as a result, it's a fee we're going to pass on to applicants. But, all right, so we'll take a look at this some more and come back and hopefully report out next week, or next meeting on some of that information.
If there's no more comments, we'll move on to the next agenda item, committee member and staff comments. Any comments from the committee?
No.
Staff? Just so everyone knows, we're wrapping up most of our discussions on what council had for you all. We've discussed the rental rights program, outreach, and the mediation program. Next meeting, I believe, we'll be bringing back the review of the rental rights program. And then the final meeting, you all will have the opportunity to discuss anything you'd like.
Are we at meeting number 10 today? Is that what it is?
I think it's 9.
Really?
Are these, did we add on some meetings from the ones that we missed?
12 meetings, we're still, I think, 3 out, so we still have 3 meetings,
When is our final meeting?
June, most likely.
But
Nothing else.
I wonder if it might, I'm kind of thinking out loud here with staff, but I'm wondering if we might want to check in with the council and kind of give them an update before we conclude with maybe our last 3 meetings, just to see if there's anything else or if they have any questions. We did say at some point we would check in with them. Maybe now would be a good time before we start to go on the tail end of things.
Is it just going to be a memo or a discussion with
Just
them?
staff report, just an update on what we've talked about, the number of meetings we've held, and some of the discussion points and things like that, and that we plan on bringing back a rental rights program ordinance discussion based upon what we heard in our previous meetings and some of the other things.
I mean, considering the format of how we have to, how far in advance we have to write the report to council, might be better if just a memo. Isn't it like 3 weeks in advance now that we have to have everything prepared?
Yeah, if we do decide to give an update to council, it would push out the meeting dates 1 more month. So I don't know if that's a concern by any member of the committee, if we did that.
It would just be a budget thing. We were budgeted for fiscal year 22, 23.
Always about the money.
And just one question, I got comments too. It's about email that you sent it for a survey. And why did they close too fast? You delivered the email on 17, it was closed on 20.
I think that's Pam's. I'm not a.
Right, that was another section of housing that requested the survey, and they needed it in a quick amount of time. So that explains the 3 days.
Kind of, how many did you get so far? We are 60% of, we are renters, so how many did they have a
If I'm
chance
not-
to
Actually, I
do?
just read that report today. If I remember correctly, it was, the survey was sent out to, I think, 16,000 people, and about 800 returned and answered the survey. And so those survey results were required by the Department of Housing and Urban Development in order for us to apply for this special round of funding, which we can qualify for $5.1 million to build affordable housing. And so there was a quick deadline on that, and that's why it was a 3-day survey.
It will be great, we prevent those short notice, right? Because there is a bunch of people and probably this overlook this email because it was very short period of time.
It could have. It
Yeah.
could have been, yeah.
You're not
But
gonna-
there are also those emails where if it sits longer than 3 days, no one's ever going to answer it as well. It's a,
But it's very important email,
right,
very important.
right. This one was under a timeline, so that's why that short notice.
All right. Next on the agenda is new business. We have no new business. So we will be
Entertain a
adjourn.
motion to adjourn?
Wait,
Oh, no.
next meeting is going to be on, sorry,
April 26th.
April 26th?
Yep.
All right, so-
I'm sorry, what was that?
April 26th.
6?
All right. Can we get a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
We stand adjourned at 8:01 PM.